Hello, everybody. Welcome to stage 4 of our king and pawn ending journey. I hope everyone is ready. We have, in the first 3 stages, hopefully many of you, especially players who are starting out at the beginning levels, not really familiar with these ideas at all. Hopefully everyone has watched the videos at least once or twice, and so you will be able to move forward confidently to the much more advanced and tricky concepts when it comes to mastering these king and pawn endings. The big three in terms of understanding and mastering king and pawn endings are flanking, triangulation, and corresponding squares. We will get into all three, and first on the docket is flanking, and obviously the subject of today's video, as you can see from the title. And just one more thing to remember is that if you find you're losing your way during this video, really taking the time to back up, even reviewing stage 3, which was a much more practical video with some fun positions to help you calculate. Really taking the time to make sure that you've understood the evolution of what we've done so far, one thing on top of another, will help you. And don't be afraid to take your time doing that. It's when building your muscles here in these king and pawn endings, you really can't skip a step. And it's the same concept that we're applying. Like I said, one of the goals when we set out here was to master the king and pawn endings, not just so that we're good at the king and pawn endings, but so that we have a better ability to evaluate all types of more complicated endings. Because every ending, after just a few trades, whether it's a minor piece ending, rook ending, queen ending, whatever, all endings have the potential to reach a king and pawn ending. So your understanding of the ensuing position not only improves your ability to calculate king and pawn endings, but also your ability to evaluate the much more complex position. So that's just kind of the philosophy of what we're doing here, and hopefully we've all kind of ingrained that and bought into that concept. White's last move was king to b5. We are evaluating what black needs to play here in order to hold and defend this position. The topic on the docket today is flanking. And before we move further, the first part of this position is not really going to be displaying a flanking idea, but it's good just to solve. Hopefully you can anticipate white's threat here and make the right decision for your king. Obviously you're choosing between two squares, a7 and c7. If you want to take the time to solve it, which I encourage you to, please pause the video now. Okay, and you are back from your pausing video. You got up and you took a break and prepared yourself, and we're going to move forward. Black's only move to draw is king to c7. The reason is not because of the flanking idea, but because of white's threat, which is to move one of the pawns forward. By moving to c7, you are not afraid of him pushing the c-pawn. You would simply capture, and despite white gaining the opposition, you see the bigger picture, the forest through the trees, and you realize that he has a corner pawn, so he can have the opposition all he wants, even reach king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th. We already know that this endgame is a draw. Not much else to that. So king to c7 prevents a pawn trade. Obviously, trading the a pawn when our king is directly aligned here would do nothing but allow us to come forward, easily gaining the opposition and holding a draw. Hopefully, again, I'm not going to explain this all the way to the end, but if you understand the concepts and why the pawn should not be able to go in front of the king, then you know that this is already a forced draw as long as black comes straight back from the pawn, preparing to grab opposition. And so king to c7 prevents white from trading pawns. One instructive example to see that king to c7 is the only move that draws is to see what happens after king a7. Here, white can trade the a pawn, and by grabbing the opposition, he now, as I like to call it, can walk the dog all the way over in front of the pawn. A funny version of walking the dog might be something like this, I guess, even with the kings being all the way over here. You might see an example where we can walk the dog. Pushing the pawn would not win, obviously, because the king could catch. But moving forward with the king to grab opposition, and then walking the dog all the way in front of the pawn, and only once you've reached your goal of walking your pawn up the hallway, you will now start taking the square that he's given up. That's a little bit of an instructive idea, just to see that even if the kings are at a distance away from the pawn, you can walk the dog. Let's see here. Back to our beginning position. After white moves forward and grabs the opposition, black moves to c7. White's only other way to make progress, since we've established that pushing the pawns will not work, would be to play king to a6. And his goal is simple, to show you. What he wants to do, after you're maintaining a rank opposition along the rank, he would like to come to the rear of the pawn and bait black into going after the pawns. Black says, hey, did you forget that I have the ability to come forward? But what white realizes is that by coming to the side of the pawn, using the side of the pawn, and eventually coming up the rear of the pawn, he is flanking, just like the military term, flanking the enemy out by the side or the rear. And unfortunately for black, he is not able to capture two pawns at once. So we end up with a position of zugzwang. White will capture the pawn and march it to kingdom come. So see it again. If white makes progress via the side of the pawn, the rank, and eventually trying to come to the rear, black cannot be tempted to come forward because he cannot win this endgame. He has to hold the position by preventing flanking. Preventing flanking. How does he do that? By holding the rank. This position is now an easy draw because black will never let the white king out. Maybe eventually white gets impatient enough and tries to make a trade, but that doesn't help. Look again to see that what white was trying to do was to flank the enemy. And if black is not aware of this idea, he might be tempted to come forward, and in which case he would lose very quickly. This concept is going to be applied to much more complex and much more practical positions as we move forward. Next song. Here we see a position, a famous one, and one that I'm pretty confident is in one of those good endgame books I recommended, Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual. White to play, people. Focus and see if you can prevent your opponent from winning this endgame. Ready, set, go. Okay. Hopefully you paused the video, taken as much time as you needed. I recommend 3 to 5 minutes. Not any more than that, because in a real game, you may not ever take more than that. Like I said, one of my I'm really big on trying to make every study like an over-the-board situation, pushing yourself to solve things before you let yourself see the answer. But you don't want to, spend hours on it either. Just spending 3 to 5 minutes, putting forth some effort will help. Even if you're completely wrong about the idea, will help you to take it home with you, and keep that idea as a part of your approach. So white only draws in this ending with the double exclamation, king to h1, finding the correct corresponding square and preventing his opponent from flanking him. Here's why. This is a very similar situation as to one we experienced before, where except it was white had the two pawns, right? The one we just did. But in this situation, the kings are a little bit further, they're a further distance away from each other, which always makes it harder to dictate the opposition because you have to anticipate waiting moves and all kinds of tricks. But with that being said, simple calculation can tell you that the most obvious way to try to hold this position eventually runs you into a brick wall. Now you are forced to take one of these three squares, and on any one of them, black will gain the opposition. If you go here, he can gain the opposition by gaining a tempo and then coming back. What will we be forced to do in a situation like this? Start moving forward and be pushed out, eventually losing the pawn and losing the game. Take another look. We cannot hold with direct opposition because we run into our own pawn. But ultimately, when you start to understand this concept of corresponding squares, you don't have to be fixated on direct one square apart opposition, because ultimately it just matters that when the critical opposition moment is reached, like if the king came closer to a pawn, that you would be able to hold the opposition. Not that you have the opposition forever to make yourself feel warm and cozy. All that matters is that when the critical moment is reached, you will have opposition. So king h1 is awesome. If king to e1, I will play king to g1. If king to e2, I will play king to g2. Let's say he waits. Well, obviously I'm going to go here. If king to e3, I will play king to g3. If king to e2, I will play king to g2. If king to e1, I will go king to g1. And so he waits again. We maintain this distant opposition only coming forward when he does. And by the way, if he backs up, where do we go again? We back up. We have not made any progress here. And it's important when you understand that you are the defender of the endgame that, again, you don't get tempted to try to come forward, allowing him to flank you and push you out. Okay? The only trick to be aware of after king h1, a tactical trick, which is g4. However, hopefully you can all see that this move does not win. Not because you capture. If you capture, that's the trick. Black ends up queening with check. F takes, e4, g5, e3, g6, e2, g7, queenie poo. This is not the problem. with g4. The problem is that once the pawn is committed, white simply moves the king back, and either next move we will capture, in which case both of us will be getting queens without checks, easy draw, or he will capture us, which is basically bringing our king forward one tempi at a time. He's helping us come out, and we will pick up the pawn within the next move. So you can watch the beginning of this video again a couple times if you need to, both sections before we move on to the latter part of the video if you'd like. But we've seen examples of aggressive and defensive flanking. Corresponding squares, essentially the definition of corresponding squares. As I said, any opposition is actually corresponding squares, but eventually we get to the point where corresponding squares is an advanced concept all on its own, which will not be in this video. But here we see another mini example of corresponding squares. Essentially, what corresponding squares is this. It's the recognition that, okay, when my opponent gets to ax, y square, when my opponent gets to, say given square, I have to be able to go there. That's all you've recognized. When my opponent gets to certain square, the only square I have that holds opposition is this square. Now, this is a short example of it. Eventually, we'd like to be able to apply this concept with the kings on perhaps incredible opposite ends of the board, believe it or not. And you will have the ability as the aggressor to hopefully avoid this sort of defensive opposition, this sort of defensive opposition, or perhaps as the defender to create this sort of long-range, distant opposition, which is based on that simple recognition of corresponding squares. What is it? One more time. When my opponent goes to x given square, I have to be able to go there because it's the only square that is capable of holding on either one of his moves forward. That's an example of corresponding squares. So you need to slow down and look at that again, but this is a pretty good example of a defensive opposition, grabbing the corresponding square, and white holds the endgame. Pretty fun to see. I like doing it, kind of fun. Okay, next position, moving on. Okay. Okay, you are looking at a position that will help you to use the idea of flanking on a more aggressive level again, and obviously it's a little bit of a trickier concept. We've added a couple more pawns on the board, and in the given position we are looking at right now, it seems as though white already is in opposition or has opposition. Depending on whose move it is, the position is either very easy or very hard. If the position was black to play, the game is over. The king moves, we will maintain distant opposition until we've reached an area where we can flank him. And either he will have to go down, which will allow us to back up, or he will have to come back up, which will allow us to start to flank him. We will see an example of that in a minute. But unfortunately for you, this position, I'm just going to make a random move real quick that wouldn't do anything. Unfortunately for you, it is white to play in this position, not black to play. So how can white make progress when essentially, if you look at the position of the kings, they are exactly the same places that we were in the last position on d1 and h1. Basically, black is able to hold here via this defensive flanking, preventing flanking, corresponding squares. So what can we do? Again, make a move to get rid of the arrows. I will give you a few minutes, assuming you'll pause your video, and hopefully you pause your video. If not, pause it again. We move forward. White has a great move here that essentially loses a turn and is not that hard to find when you understand what we're trying to accomplish here, corresponding squares. What are black's only two legal moves? A6 and B6, correct? So we have options of gaining opposition on both of those moves. Now, the most obvious versions of those are D6 and E6, but unfortunately we can't say pass in this position. Chess rules don't allow it. We're in Zugzwang. But we also have the ability to use the third square here, which, by the way, is grabbing opposition with B6. King to F5, double exclamavillage. If the king moves, we're able to make progress and come forward, grabbing distant opposition. The king moves away again, and we come forward with progress. The king moves to B6, we can come to D6, and we can already see what we're doing here. Let's watch it again. King F5, King B6, King F6, King A6, King E6. Let's say he goes down via the line that I talked about. Now after King E7, he has a bad choice. Either come back up and allow our flanking process to continue. A move like this wouldn't help. We will regain the opposition and continue to push our friend out to the point where we start munching everybody. So if he can't play king b7 and he goes up, we start to flank him, the game is over. There is no way for him to prevent us from using this rear path of the pawn to eventually push the king out and pick up exactly what we need. So after we gain this opposition and he moves down, the other option is to move down himself, but we come up gaining tempos on the pawn. He plays king up to b7, defending the more important pawn. We regain the flanking opposition and push him out. Okay, the variations that occur after king takes c5 are very tricky and actually also winning. For players who are watching the video and would like to know right away, I wouldn't mind. You can make comments here, and I will explain to you why king takes c5 is not in white's best interest. And it also opens up possible drawing tricks. I will just that'll help you to show you just one example. If white was to misplay this position and allow something like this position is now a theoretical draw, as white can beat his head against the wall here, but won't make progress and does not have enough time to come around without black picking up the pawn and getting back. In some variations, white can even risk losing. That's not an exact explanation as to what's wrong with king takes c5, but we're going to get to that exact type of endgame, believe it or not, in a future video. So just hold your horses. Okay. What matters, it really doesn't matter here, even if you're frustrated that I'm not showing you right away, it doesn't really matter because your perspective of this endgame is a white perspective, right? And if your perspective is a white perspective, I've already told you that you don't even really need to take c5 to win. You're using flanking. That's our point. He can't give you this pawn. This pawn leads to everybody, okay? So you're using flanking. You don't even need that pawn. You eventually push him out and the game is over. So take another look if you need to. Envisioning the position in your head if you can. My buddy David Pruis recommends that in some of his videos, and as a way to get better, I'm definitely into that, of trying to calculate in your head. And even if you're doing something that, let's say you know the idea, or it's something that is a little bit below your level, quote unquote, you might still make the effort to solve a position in your head, even if you think you know the answer, because the more you're visualizing things and calculating things in your head, it's like you're always working out. It's like staying in shape, for a real game when you obviously do not have the option to move the pieces. So if you'd like to go through this video again another time, a second time, maybe a third time, who knows, maybe 9 times, okay? Go through it as much as you want, and as the positions become more familiar to you and you start to develop an intuition about flanking, you may just make an effort to not move the pieces at all. Simply solve the positions in your head can only help. And it can only help those ideas really become ingrained in your thought process. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed our video lecture today, stage 4, and stay tuned.